Let me show you something worth noticing. There's a moment that happens to almost everyone who's ever tried to build wealth, and it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels more like a Tuesday afternoon when you're sitting at your desk, staring at a number on a screen, and you realize you've been watching that number for 3 years, not managing it, not growing it, just watching it. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that the time you spent watching was worth more than the number itself. Most people think about money in terms of loss and gain. Did I lose money? Did I make money? And that framework feels natural because it's how we're taught to measure financial outcomes. But there's a different kind of loss that happens underneath that one, quieter and harder to see. You're not just losing money when things go wrong. You're losing the years you could have spent learning how money actually works. Here's what I mean. Imagine someone puts $5,000 into an investment they don't really understand. Maybe it's a stock tip from a friend. Maybe it's a fund they saw mentioned online. They don't research it. They don't know what it does or why it moves the way it moves. They just put the money in and wait. 6 months later, it's worth $4,500. They feel bad. They tell themselves they'll wait until it comes back. 2 years later, it's worth $4,800. Still down. Still waiting. Now ask yourself, what actually got lost here? Yes, they're down $200. But that's not the most expensive part. The most expensive part is that they spent 2.5 years in a relationship with money that taught them nothing. They didn't learn how to evaluate an investment. They didn't learn how to read a financial statement. They didn't learn what risk actually feels like or how to manage it. They just learned how to wait and feel bad. And here's the part that makes it worse. Those 2.5 years weren't neutral. They weren't just empty time. They were formative. Because when you spend years watching money and feeling anxious about it without understanding it, you're training yourself to associate money with anxiety. You're building a mental habit, and that habit has a cost that compounds. I know someone who spent almost a decade in a job they hated because the salary felt safe. They weren't saving much. They weren't investing. They were just keeping their head down and waiting for the right moment to make a change. And every year, they'd say the same thing. Next year, when I have a little more saved, when the market's better, when I feel more secure, and the years kept going. What they didn't realize until much later was that the security they were waiting for wasn't financial. It was psychological. They were waiting to feel ready. But the feeling of readiness doesn't come from waiting. It comes from doing things that scare you and surviving them. And by avoiding that discomfort for 10 years, they didn't just lose income or investment returns. They lost a decade of learning how to trust themselves with risk. That's what I mean when I say you're not losing money. You're losing years. Because the real asset isn't the money in your account. It's the person you become while you're building it. And if you spend those years afraid to act, afraid to learn, afraid to make mistakes, you end up with something worse than a bad portfolio. You end up with a version of yourself that doesn't know how to move. Here's the mechanism that makes this so hard to see. When you think about a financial mistake, your brain focuses on the dollar amount. You lost $500, you missed out on a gain, you overpaid for something, and that number feels concrete. It feels like the thing that matters, but the number is just the surface. The deeper cost is what you didn't do while you were fixated on it. Think about someone who spends 5 years trying to time the market. They're waiting for the perfect entry point. They're reading headlines. They're watching indexes. They're convinced that if they just wait a little longer, they'll know the right moment, and maybe they do eventually buy in, or maybe they don't. But either way, they spent 5 years thinking about timing instead of learning about allocation, diversification, tax efficiency, or compounding. They spent 5 years practicing the wrong skill. And the thing about practicing the wrong skill is that it's not passive. You're not just failing to learn the right thing. You're actively getting better at the wrong thing. You're building neural pathways. You're creating defaults. And those defaults are what show up when the stakes are higher. I've seen this happen with inheritance. Someone receives a large sum of money, maybe from a parent or a settlement, and they freeze. They don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to lose it. So they leave it in cash, and they tell themselves they're being careful. They're being responsible. They're waiting until they know what to do. And then 5 years pass. Inflation eats at it. Opportunity cost piles up, and they still don't know what to do because they spent 5 years not learning. The loss isn't the inflation. The loss is that they had 5 years to become someone who knows how to manage a significant amount of money, and they chose not to. And now they're 5 years older, and the money is still sitting there, and they still don't trust themselves with it. There's a concept that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's called opportunity cost. But most people think about it wrong. They think opportunity cost is about the money you didn't make, the investment you didn't buy, the job you didn't take. But the deeper opportunity cost is the person you didn't become, the skills you didn't build, the confidence you didn't earn. Every year you spend avoiding financial decisions is a year you're not developing financial judgment. And financial judgment isn't something you can download. It's not something you learn from a book or a course. You learn it by making decisions, seeing what happens, adjusting, and making more decisions. It's a feedback loop. And if you're not in the loop, you're not learning. Here's what this looks like in real time. Two people start with the same amount of money, same age, same income. One of them starts investing early, makes mistakes, loses some money, learns, adjusts, keeps going. The other one waits, reads articles, watches videos, tells themselves they'll start when they understand it better. 10 years later, the first person has a portfolio that's grown, yes, but more importantly, they have 10 years of experience. They know what a correction feels like. They know how their emotions respond to volatility. They know what kinds of investments match their temperament. They become someone who can manage money. The second person finally starts investing. And now they're 10 years behind, not just in dollar terms, but in psychological terms. They're stepping into volatility for the first time at 40 instead of 30. They're learning lessons they could have learned earlier when the stakes were lower and the time horizon was longer. They're playing catch-up, not just with money, but with themselves. And here's the part that no one tells you. You can't catch up on experience. You can catch up on contributions. You can catch up on savings. But you can't get back the years of learning. You can't compress a decade of trial and error into a weekend seminar. The learning happens in time, under pressure, with consequences. And if you avoid the pressure, you avoid the learning. This is why some people reach 50 with a decent net worth and still feel terrified of money. Because they never built the relationship. They never went through the process of making decisions and surviving them. They outsourced it. They delayed it. They got lucky with income or inheritance, but they never became someone who knows how to manage wealth. And that gap, that missing skill set, haunts them. Now think about the reverse. Think about someone who started early, made mistakes, lost money, but kept going. By the time they're 50, money doesn't scare them. Not because they're rich, but because they've been through the cycle enough times to trust themselves. They've seen their portfolio drop and recover. They've made bad calls and survived. They've learned that mistakes aren't fatal. And that psychological foundation is worth more than any single investment return. So when I say you're not losing money, you're losing years, this is what I mean. The years are the asset. The years are where the learning happens. And if you spend them afraid to act, you're not preserving wealth. You're losing the most valuable thing you have, which is the time to become someone who doesn't need to be afraid. There's no clean resolution here. You can't go back and start earlier. You can't undo the years you spent waiting. But you can recognize what's actually at stake right now. It's not just the money. It's the version of yourself you're becoming while you decide what to do with it. And that version is being built whether you're paying attention or not. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next.